We have a very special event today. Really delighted to welcome Professor Kristen, who is at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, and we're very lucky to get her on her East Coast tour. I'll just say a few words about Kristen. Kristen received her PhD and Master's in Political Science from UCLA. She is an associate professor, the equivalent, in the Department of Political Science at the University of Gothenburg, and works on survey methodology and experimental design projects, largely in the Middle East and North Africa, although she's worked on other areas as well. And she has a lot of funded projects, including a multi-method comparative study of the integration of Syrian migrants into various countries in Europe, the Middle East, and the United States over a long-term period. She's also doing a study on the drivers of forgiveness versus revenge among diverse groups in Iraq, and a variety of surveys in East Africa and other issues. I won't go into all of the areas that her research has covered, but it's quite impressive how much she's covered in a relatively short amount of time. She's published extensively, including in the top journals in political science, and her work has won awards, including her, in 2019, a project on post-conflict reconciliation in Iraq received the Burdett Pi Sigma Alpha Award for the best paper presented at the APSA annual meeting. And she's received a lot of funding from different European and American foundations and institutions. So today we're going to hear about new work, and I think Kristen's going to share with us areas where she particularly liked feedback, and this is a great group to provide feedback. So thanks for taking time to share your work with us.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so I'm really excited to be here today, and thank you so much, Melanie, for making this happen. This is work that I'm really hoping to get under review very soon, and I'm a little bit concerned that there's maybe just too much going on in the paper. I think we all have this where you are doing research and it's just there's so many interesting findings and you want to present them all. Maybe it's a little too much, or maybe you think it's okay. So let's see. So the paper is about really the effects of justice on, in this case, authorities' legitimacy. And this is, it's coming out of a quasi-experimental sort of research design in Iraq, but hopefully also has larger implications. And I should say that I'm pursuing further research funding for this work in other countries right now. And so thinking larger in those terms, I would really love comments on like ideas for the future or where else to try to expand to. Let's see how this works a little bit. There we go. Okay, so first I'm just going to motivate a bit more about why I'm pursuing this project and why I think it's important, and also to try to convince you that it's also larger than this one tiny case where I'm going to get into like the nitty-gritty of why does justice matter and why should we ask people about it. Okay, so as we know then, wars or violence often actually begets violence, and that's sort of the starting point. Wars often involve these like horrific atrocities that create these deep-seated grievances among differing sides, and these grievances often persist for decades afterwards, even crossing generations. And this enduring animosity then results in a high likelihood of returning to conflict, and what's known as the conflict trap. And the statistics are pretty staggering, right? Like about maybe something around 4 in 10 countries return to violence within the first decade after peace. And today, around 90% of civil wars are actually repeat occurrences of violence. It's a pretty widespread phenomenon too. You can think of all these cases beyond Iraq also, like Nigeria, Somalia, Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Colombia, Myanmar, just to name a few, but we're covering sort of the globe here. And what this all sort of is pointing to is that forgiving and forgetting, or lack of justice, is sort of widely blamed for causing the repetition of human rights violations and the return to violence. And so justice is often seen as this key for breaking out of the conflict trap. And then we can also see then that in recent decades, transitional justice has been kind of promoted then by the UN and other both international organizations and also just national policymakers as an important solution for preventing the recurrence of violence in war-torn countries. It's become an almost like universally prescribed solution for post-conflict reconciliation, so much so that some scholars call it the justice cascade. And you can really see then, this coming out of Catherine Sekink's work, and she's just updated her database on transitional justice mechanisms, and she's showing sort of that around the 1990s to 2000s, if we're just thinking about domestic and international trials, putting individuals on trial for human rights violations, it's really making a big jump in the 1990s and early 2000s, all the way up until like the COVID period where it takes a drop. But, and then I also take this lovely graph from Barbara Uman's work, which is kind of older, but what I really like about it is that it shows on the left side the millions of dollars being spent on transitional justice sort of legal programming, and on the right side the number of projects. And you can see also this is sort of exploding in the late 1990s, early 2000s. More than 70 governments around the world have employed transitional justice mechanisms since 1974. And another really important reason we should care about this then is that there are and there remain widespread criticisms that much of the transitional justice funding is being wasted on programs that lack local buy-in and fail to bring about durable peace, right? And so it's become this focus for all sorts of organizations. And there's this really nice sort of quote from Stover and Weinstein's work that really highlights how many international aid agencies and their national counterparts sort of forego collecting and analyzing population data prior to launching these social reconstruction programming and policies and projects. And as a result, then millions of dollars have been wasted on ill-conceived projects that fail to meet the needs of those that have been most affected by violence. And that's sort of sad and something that we should be worried about. Okay, so then what do we mean when we say justice or injustice? And the conceptualization of justice that I use in this project really comes out of the field of clinical psychology. It's coming from this seminal work by Everett Worthington. It's this idea that an injustice gap occurs when a victim feels that the recompense, the thing that we do to make up for whatever wrong we committed, falls short of what the victim sort of perceives is commensurate with that transgression committed. And so that's sort of like, you know, when that happens, it makes it that you can't get over that wrong. And you sort of hold on to this bitter resentment. It's really hard to forgive and to let go and to move on. It also points to this idea that comes from Tom Tyler's work in the legal field, that justice is a socially constructed sort of phenomenon, right? It really matters what individuals think. It's at the individual level that notions of justice develop, and these subjective judgments about justice are really important to investigate and understand. They're determining how people think about these past events, and they're also guiding their actions and behaviors today. Okay, so in post-conflict settings then, leaders have to sort of walk this fine line between both under punishment, which can then, you know, you can imagine that if they miss the mark by not punishing hard enough, people will feel like, oh, those perpetrators, they didn't make up for the wrong. Maybe I will take justice into my own hands and sort of impose a further punishment on them. And that sort of violates, you know, rule of law and like legitimacy of justice systems. And so vigilantism or extrajudicial revenge is of serious concern, especially in these settings where the rule of law has been often destroyed or especially challenged. One only need think of the sort of in the aftermath of World War II, these Nazi hit squads, but also in the case of Iraq and ISIS, there's been reports of those accused of collaboration with ISIS being tossed off of buildings. You can even think today in Ukraine, there are these hit squads forming to target people suspected of collaborating with Russia. The original conceptualization of an injustice gap was really focused on this underpunishment, and that sort of comes from these actually more intimate relationships from clinical psychology. But one might also question then what would happen, especially in these post-conflict cases, where leaders may overpunish the accused and then sort of delegitimize the justice process and turning it into what's known as victor's justice, right? It's a distorted application of justice by the victorious party. And that can also then lead to simmering resentment and potentially lead back to violence for the group that maybe feels it's being unjustly targeted and overpunished. Okay, so then this is sort of just like a broader theoretical understanding of the bigger motivations of this project. And so there really is then this sort of theory that justice will lead, if we can get justice right and make people feel like just recompense or appropriate recompense has happened for these atrocities that have been committed, then that can lead to reconciliation, bringing people back together in the same social space so that they're interacting in a pro-social way. It will also hopefully impart legitimacy, either new legitimacy on new actors that have kind of stepped into the power vacuum from the conflict, or maybe the legitimacy of old actors who had violated norms and then now need to sort of regain the ability to impose the rule of law, right? We want citizens to go back to believing there's institutions and systems in place, there are rules, and there are proper appropriate authorities that we should follow who apply these rules and who tell us what the rules are and ask us to follow them, and we will follow them if we believe in that legitimacy. And this all should then lead to durable peace. So the importance of legitimacy, I've already hinted at that, right? It's sort of this conceptualization. This is building off of, I know James Gibson describes it a lot in this way, this reservoir of support that officials or authorities can can sort of dip into and draw from even to gain obedience, even in times of crises. So you can imagine it's even when a leader wants you to do something that you disagree with, you'll do it if you believe that they are, appropriate and right, and they maybe know better than you. They can rely on this reservoir of support. And so I think that's a hard test of legitimacy. It's precisely when one disagrees with an authority, but they willingly comply with his or her commands. And sensitivity to popular opinion, then, concerning appropriate justice mechanisms is important. There's a broad literature also finding that, if people sort of agree with justice being imposed, with legitimacy of leaders, then they will, have more trust and they will actually comply with what these institutions are asking them to do. And this is super important in post-conflict settings because we know that transitional justice processes, they take many years. They take a lot of effort. They're complicated. They don't arise out of thin air. Committed leaders are usually needed to both begin and then organize and then sustain the motivation behind these processes, which often take many years. And the thing that I think is also really important about this study is that we need to better understand the legitimacy of the differing authorities that are involved in these processes. I think up until now, we've tended to treat justice as a sort of already defined realm of the state. The state has these rules and these legal books and this precedence, and it's already decided how, judgments should go and how the processes should go. Of course, that all gets destroyed kind of in conflict, often at least. And in reality, Western systems of jurisprudence have often been exported and kind of imposed over these more customary institutions that have already existed for a long time. So the question then in a lot of these non-Western, well, maybe even Western contexts to some degree, is not only what constitutes justice, but who are the most legitimate arbiters of justice. So this study, I'm seeking to sort of challenge the idea of justice as the realm of the state and seek to re-theorize it from a non-state, non-Western perspective. And post-conflict settings are great to do this because they represent these moments when the state is in crisis mode and the state institutions. And I think this quote from Gibson and Caldera, they have a little bit of work on this in South Africa. They still focus on sort of supreme courts. That's where most of our understanding about like legitimacy of these state justice providers comes from, is really these looking at courts, and especially supreme courts in the West. But they argue then that the theory of legitimacy, so widely accepted among scholars studying stable Western democracies, must be recast and rethought if it is to apply to great parts, if not most, of the world. Okay, so now I'm sort of narrowing in on the case at hand, and I'm looking at sort of what's happened in the aftermath of the Islamic State in Iraq. ISIS, as you may or may not know, is a Sunni militant extremist group. And in Iraq, in response to that group sort of taking over of large swaths of Iraqi society, so much so that at one point it was governing more than 5 million people just in Iraq, not including Syria. The response has been pretty heavy-handed. There's been these mass arrests and very quick trials. They're some as short as 5 minutes. Obviously, due process is not really happening. And also, there's not differentiation between lesser and harsher crimes then. And it's sort of, oftentimes there's these anti-terrorism laws that prescribe 15 years imprisonment or maybe the death penalty for acts of terrorism, which these accused collaborators are falling under. And we can imagine then that in some cases maybe that's appropriate, but maybe in other cases a youth that was sort of recruited into the ISIS fold and committed acts, or maybe a woman who was forcibly married to an ISIS fighter. They are also receiving these types of punishments. And so there's been kind of this widespread fear or feeling maybe among Sunnis of collective punishment of their group just for being the group that ISIS sort of came from, and this fear that it's generating potentially grievances and possibly an ISIS 2.0. Okay, so even today, there's still about 1 million IDPs stuck in these camps. So this is not even including the ones that are, the collaborators that are in jail, but these IDPs are still unable to sort of go back and live in society. And some of them are accused, rightly or wrongly, but there's still many of them stuck. And you can kind of see where they're stuck. I should highlight that many have also returned, and that's partly what this project is about too, is reconciliation with these returnees versus revenge against them. But the study then is really focusing on Al-Anbar, Nineveh, and then Baghdad. And I chose those for those 3 governorates for specific reasons, but one of the main ones was that they are experiencing the return of these types of IDPs. I think one last thing I should say also is that tribal and religious authorities are frequently involved in these reintegration or resettlement processes and justice provision throughout these areas. This sponsorship system that I'm talking about is often even sponsored or supported by international organizations, and it's this idea that a local tribal authority can lend his credibility and sponsor a returnee, and that will mean that others in the community who respect that tribal leader won't attack that person out of respect for that tribal leader. And so they've been, this is one way that the Iraqi government and also international agencies have been trying to get these people reintegrated. I already said that it's from these 3 governorates. It's a tablet-based survey. It was randomly sampled and tried to be as representative of the governorates as possible. It was done door-to-door with 4,592 Iraqis. I should note then that this sort of breakdown, it should be sort of expected, since a lot of the areas like Al-Anbar is pretty much almost 100% Sunni. And so I am able to consider differences maybe across the Sunni-Shia backgrounds, which you'll see me do actually, but I can't really, unfortunately in this project, do much about understanding what the minorities think. And that's unfortunate, but there are limits in money. Mainly money is usually our limit. Okay, Then I'm just talking, or wanted to show here a little bit about the 3 different types of systems that I'm considering in this study. And there's state law, and I've already talked about, it's sort of this European colonial authorities imposing civil law systems over these other systems that are maybe more indigenous and have been there already in place for a long time. And of course, then it's been modified over the years, and most recently, this coalitional provisional authority in 2003. Religious law is also extensively used in Iraq. There are Sharia courts. Sharia refers to this body of divinely revealed law expressed in the Quran, and also the sayings and the practices of the Prophet Muhammad. And I should say then there's overlap and recognition of these systems for each other. Iraq's constitution, it defines the official religion of the state and, as Islam, and it's also a foundational source of legislation. And then tribal law, so most Iraqis identify with a tribe, and tribes have been these important providers of justice since before the founding of the state, and they are also recognized in Iraq's constitution for the development of society. There are lots of institutions. There's a Ministry of Tribal Affairs. So these systems, sometimes they conflict, but they often work also in a complementary way, especially at the local level and in justice provision. So if a case is sort of decided by a tribal or religious authority, then the state will often take into consideration that decision, and then especially if there was like a punishment already applied, they might reduce the sentence from the state based on that. So, and they often work in tandem, and it's not always about competition. In-depth studies on the ground in Iraq do find that tribal law, or urf, it does not differ greatly between tribes nor Sunnis and Shias. It does differ, don't get me wrong, but it's not huge differences. And it also maybe is good to note that many tribes in Iraq also have both Sunni and Shia members. So there's sort of cross-cutting cleavages going on here that I'm trying to highlight. Okay, so what are we doing in this study? The method is survey experiments. And first, I'm going to measure the legitimacy of these differing actors. And I'll tell you a bit more about that measure in a bit. We're going to create a description of a former hypothetical ISIS collaborator. This is building off my work with Mara Revkin. That was the one that won that award and is published in AJPS. Then I'm going to gauge the popular conceptions of the appropriate justice for a transgression from the respondent. And then I'm going to randomize a punishment that has been chosen by a randomized authority to create a sort of injustice gap. And finally, I'm going to gauge the effects of those injustice gaps as my independent variable on change in the legitimacy of those authorities as my dependent variable. So you'll see. This is the dependent variable. It's measuring the pre versus post intervention legitimacy, and I have a very targeted measure of legitimacy. This is kind of building off my work with Ellen Lust and Kate Baldwin in Sub-Saharan Africa, that's also published in AJPS, that's finding that, it's great and fine to ask about trust in authorities generally, but if you really want to understand what's going to go on with a specific case or specific issue, you need to recognize that differing authorities may have differing levels of legitimacy over differing processes, right? And so this is very specific. Is it right and proper? Common definition of legitimacy coming from Lipset, that citizens obey the decisions of these actors regarding punishments for those accused of collaboration with the Islamic State. The profile, this is not the focus of this study. Yes?
You just on the previous slide, what exactly how is it phrased tribal leaders and religious leaders, right? Because tribal leaders, the tribes are very segmented. So it could be the Ashira, it could be the Fakhad, it could be go all the way down. And this is a part of the country too where the Iraqi government and the US authorities manipulated who was a leader and who wasn't when they selected certain people during the surge. And then religious leaders can be a whole bunch of different things. It could be mosque preachers, it could be grand ayatollahs, it could be the Ministry of Awqaf. So how is it phrased?
I believe, we're going to see, but I believe it's your local tribal leader. So it's however the respondent sort of saw it as who was like their local tribal leader. Okay, so then the profile is shown, and it randomizes these sort of features. This is used at a different sort of study, so it's not the focus here. But the point is to sort of make it very realistic to the person that we are considering an actual hypothetical collaborator, or an actual, like a person who is real and you can actually think about it, and it's not just sort of this like amorphous being in your mind. And then it's, we're going to measure, this is the dependent variable for that study, is the punishment that you think is appropriate for this person. And I have ranged this on a scale, and I validated this with the population to make sure that they agree with this order. And I have told them it's a least harsh versus most harsh, so I'm trying to make it an ordinal variable. And then we create the injustice gap. So I am prompting them with each question that, recall, you chose X punishment for this, as appropriate punishment for this accused collaborator. Now imagine that authority, these local religious leaders, the Iraqi state court judges, and the local tribal leaders have conducted an investigation. So they've done some work to do their due process and due diligence, and they decided that this accused former collaborator deserves, and it's one of these randomized punishments from that scale. And what that does then is create these injustice gaps. This is my independent variable. And so here's a distribution. A -4 then on this scale would mean that the participant wanted capital punishment, and yet an authority deemed that no punishment was appropriate in the experiment. You can see it's not totally normally distributed. Again, that's because this is a quasi-experiment, which I can explain further in question and answer if you like. Okay. So now we have the findings. So first, these are all pre-registered hypotheses, and it's showing the results from 4 regression models that test the effects of different types of injustice gaps on leaders' legitimacy. And so what it's really showing you then is the first 3 are similar to each other, but the first one is sort of any injustice gap at all, just a 0 or 1 measure. The second one is what happens when authorities overpunish. The third one is what happens when they underpunish, so it's sort of like dividing that in half. And we can see actually all 3 of those have very similar, pretty strong effects. So I have changed this legitimacy scale to range from 0 to 1. So the effects is, they lose about 16 percentage points on this scale of legitimacy for the presence of gaps. And then what's happening here is I'm actually taking the absolute value of the gaps. And so you can think of, this is all being compared to no injustice gap here at the 0 line. So you can think about like one step away, if you wanted amnesty and then they got 1 year of community service required, then the leader is losing legitimacy. It's about an 11 percentage point effect, and that is significant. And then significantly different from both that and the 0 is this injustice gap size of 2. And then injustice gap size 3 and 4 are significantly different from both 2 and 1 as well as 0. And now we're getting to very big effects. We're getting to like a quarter of the scale is being taken away when the authority gets the punishment very wrong. So now I'm moving more, this is a more exploratory analysis about how does getting justice wrong matter for different types of leaders. And I didn't pre-register a hypothesis on this because I didn't actually know how this would go. I knew I was interested in it, but it's hard to know how these things will work out. But you can see then if we compare the injustice gap of 1 to 0, it's pretty similar across all 3 types of leaders, how much legitimacy they're losing. But once we get to an injustice gap the size of 4, we can see then it's not such a big difference for tribal leaders. Yeah, they lose a little more legitimacy, but it's not actually significantly different. Whereas when we get to state court judges, it's a much bigger effect. So compared to the tribal leaders, I believe that effect is, it's about, I think there's a 9 percentage point difference here. It's a 9 percentage point difference from here to here. And yeah, it's quite a big effect then for state authorities when they get the injustice gap very wrong. I think that whole difference is 16 percentage points from there to there. Whereas from here to here for the tribal leaders, it's only 7 percentage points. Okay, so what can explain this? I am going to spend a little bit of time trying to get into that, as I'm sure it's a question on your mind. And this was actually, it was pre-registered in that I am following a lot of work that's been done in these weird, Western, educated, industrialized, rich democracies that finds that what's known as procedural legitimacy. This is the belief that authorities are making their decisions fairly. A lot of work by Tom Tyler really relies on this, and he's run a lot of across a lot of different types of samples, especially in the West, and has found that it's not so much what the outcome is; it's really whether or not a person perceives that the decision was come to in a fair way. And he also shows that compliance really sort of depends on that. So it's this idea then that this fairness of the decision process is leading to a belief that this authority is still right and proper for making these decisions, and then leading to compliance with those decisions. And so I did have an outcome question or it's sort of a mechanism question on fairness. And I am then interacting that with the presence of an injustice gap or no gap. And this is actually significant for all types of gaps, the under and over punishments and the differing types of gaps. But what I'm really showing here then is that it seems that there's something about fairness that matters and determines whether injustice gaps matter for state authorities, but that doesn't seem to be happening for tribal authorities. And this is a significant effect for the state authorities only. So this sort of ties into that idea that we don't do enough maybe to examine the underpinnings of legitimacy for non-state actors. They're often involved in these processes for these transitional justice programming or projects, but we don't really understand when might it work, when might it not. And I think we have to think through more seriously then how we can marry sort of these differing types of underpinnings of legitimacy with these transitional justice processes and our programming in order to get better at trying to use these authorities to promote durable peace. Yeah?
Do you have the comparison with the religious authorities here?
Yeah, so it's not in here, but it basically shows the same thing as the tribal authorities, but here there's a little bit of separation. Yeah, but it's in the paper, I think. So one way to think about this, why does this happen? I've tried to be thinking this through. Of course, we can go back to Weber's conceptualization of legitimacy of the state versus other types of authorities and thinking about this legal, rational basis for the state. Maybe fairness really matters and you really care that state authorities are maybe also listening or are representing the people and are that there's no corruption in that process. Whereas maybe tribal authorities and even religious authorities are relying on this more charismatic or traditional legitimacy. Maybe, this does come through in our focus groups that tribal authorities and religious authorities, they tend to know the communities locally very well. So maybe you just put your trust in them and you believe, well, they know this community best. What do I know? Maybe, maybe they've got it. That's one potential, hypothesis that I have, but I can't really test it very well here. This was also pre-registered now. I'm getting into how does this getting justice wrong matter for respondents of differing backgrounds. So, of course, people are going to wonder for Sunnis and Shias, since they sort of maybe perceive this conflict and the response to it very differently, how does that sort of affect the results? And we do see actually then that given that Sunnis may be feeling like that they're being wrongly targeted, when the state gets it wrong, the state loses much more legitimacy among Sunnis than tribal and religious leaders do. And that's not happening for Shias. That's basically what this is showing. And so here I'm subsampling actually by type of gap. And you can see at the 0 or 1 for both state, tribal and religious authorities compared to state ones. Sunnis and Shias don't really differ. So you can see that these confidence intervals are crossing this line at 0, which indicates no effect, or no statistically distinguishable effect. But now when we start to get to these larger gaps of 2, 3, 4, especially for tribal leaders, they are maintaining their legitimacy among Sunnis much more than they are for Shia. And we've got some movement also going on for the religious authorities. Why? Again, I don't have a great answer for this. It appears that Sunnis may be more greatly affected when they see the state getting the punishment wrong, and that does make sense if you think about, the de-Baathification process, the idea that Sunnis maybe aren't actually as present among state court judges as once was, or maybe not even very much these days, and so maybe when they're getting it wrong, they're really feeling that, okay, we're being targeted, this is unfair, I'm not happy. Okay, so that's sort of all of the outcomes, and I really welcome your comments. I did do a bunch of robustness tests on all kinds of things. I added in controls, I did corrections for multiple hypothesis testing. I controlled for the initial punishment preferences, so we can think about, people who really want the death penalty, then maybe that is what's driving the outcome, and that's tying into this quasi-experimental nature. But I do find that harsher punishments lead to greater effects, but the effects still exist even for people who had wanted lighter punishments. Subsampling by the initial preference for capital punishment or amnesty, so I also cut those out, and I still find that I'd actually find then stronger effects of injustice gaps. Exclusion of those who did not believe leaders can implement the punishment. So maybe you have these priors about the leaders. Do remember that the measure is the initial legitimacy of the leaders. So we're already capturing in the measure all of your priors about these leaders. And then it's the movement, right, from that baseline. But I did check about, it is robust to belief that leaders can implement the punishment, and to those also who said they could not answer truthfully. So that's sort of a social desirability bias check. And I did a post hoc power analysis to confirm that the findings for the sectarian differences in legitimacy in tribal leaders are appropriately powered. Okay, so yeah, this project then, I really think that it's important for us to know that all leaders actually do lose legitimacy when they get justice wrong, and the effects are proportional to just how wrong they are. It demonstrates how important it is for us in these settings to really understand what are popular notions of justice, what's the sort of subjective understanding of justice on the ground, and how does that vary across different types of authorities, and how might that affect their legitimacy to be involved in these post-conflict justice processes. It's not only about the extent to which justice is served, but also about who's serving it, right? Perhaps customary authorities have these deeper reservoirs of legitimacy and different types of legitimacy that they can lend to justice processes. I also wonder, what are the scope conditions of this? Maybe it can also transfer to peaceful times. I don't know. Hopefully I will get money to find that out. I think, though, that overall we need more works on the logics of legitimation, and generalizable quantitative data is needed. So again, I'm pursuing further funding, and I love your comments if you think there's anything else I should be doing, or maybe cases I should be looking at, et cetera. And this is other work that I've published or have out online that you could look to if you're interested. Thanks.
Excellent. So we have a good amount of time for Q&A. Excuse me, Kristen, do you want me to field questions, or would you like to field your own? It's totally up to you.
You can field questions.
Okay, great. So I'll keep a list, and I would ask that everybody introduce themselves first, so Kristen has an idea who you are. Open it up. Yes.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Shivan Fazal. I'm a PhD student at Boston University. This was amazing. I would have thought that it would really be imperative also to include the perceptions of non-Muslim minorities in Iraq, like Yazidis and Christians of various denominations, who are obviously in Nineveh, the one of the main, the three provinces that you have done the survey. And if you would have had the chance to do that, how would have the perceptions measured or fared compared to the Sunnis and Shias that you have included in the analysis? Thank you very much.
Should I answer one by one, or?
So far, I've got two others. Why don't you start by answering that, and I'll see if others.
Also, I want to say that I'm going to take notes here since my computer is being used up there. Yeah, okay, so yes, I really wish I could have done more on Yazidis. There's actually some pretty good work by Adam Lichtenheld on Yazidis specifically in this context. Not on this topic, though. So the issue, I think, is really that you need a lot of power to run these sort of experiments, and I worried about I'd have to run like a census of some of these groups, to really get the power that I needed to to be able to credibly analyze. So that's part of it. I mean, it's not great. Again, if I had more money, I would have loved to have done it. How would it have mattered, though? I'm pretty sure that even among those groups, there's this loss of legitimacy sort of effects is going to happen. That's my hypothesis. The other part about how it mattered differently for Sunnis and Shias, I have no idea. I'm not going to claim that I study these groups specifically, and so I don't know how they view those authorities. But also, I didn't even have a prior necessarily for Sunnis and Shias. So, and the reason was, it's just there's not been that much work, I think, done at least empirically on this, and so it was hard to figure out how it would go. So, yeah. But thank you.
This was great, and I thought the presentation was really clear, and you answered a lot of the questions I had while you were going. I guess one top line, if we were to talk about this project to other people, would your top line be, these types of legitimacy gaps matter, especially among the sort of targeted group? Like, how do you interpret the difference between Sunnis and Shias there? And then thinking about the generalizability on these different authorities, one thing that stands out about the case is ISIS's stateness, or ISIS as explicitly attempting to create a alternative state authority. If we were to think about other groups that maybe are about the return of religious authority or the return of tribal authority, ISIS is famously the Islamic State. Do you think that would impact your generalizability in any way? Like, especially in the framing around, will this do these issues lead to ISIS 2.0, de-Baathification, et cetera?
Why don't we go one by one, because I think we have enough time to,
Yeah.
and that will enable you to.
I know it's a very nebulous question.
Oh, that's okay. I think it depends on which of the findings we're talking about. So do they only matter especially for the targeted group? Nope, I think it matters for all of the groups, and that's why, at least the first part where injustice gaps matter, and it's clear it's just mattering for the whole population, and that's also, even if I subsample it by Sunnis and Shias, it matters. It's the type of authorities thing that I think maybe also depends, and this part I don't know. So there is maybe a question of like, the state was the most legitimate authority at the outset for both groups, for both Sunnis and Shias. Maybe it's that the state has like further to fall. So I did actually do an analysis of trying to cut those that were at the extreme and then rerun it, and it still held. And it's maybe a weaker effect though, yeah. So I don't know though. I think that part is the part that I want my future research to really try to focus on, like how much are the findings on the different types of authorities, how much can I extrapolate that to other types of settings? And then, and also among the targeted group, right? Like, does this, I don't think it has to be only among a targeted group, I guess. Differing communities have differing relationships with these non-state authorities, and that's probably going to be the bigger variable there. Probably partly what you were sort of talking about, how there's like all these nested levels and there's lots of differing relationships going on between people. Like maybe you have a corrupt tribal leader in your area, and that's going to shift, right? Again, that's sort of why like I bake in the pre-legitimacy measure, and so this is a movement from that. And the case of ISIS impact, I think do these issues lead to an ISIS 2.0? I think these issues lead to a recurrence of violence regardless of if it's just ISIS or among the targeted group. Because I think you often have cases with post-conflict settings where groups are unsatisfied. I think there's an important question of, is there actually any room for agreement, right? Like, can you get these two sides that are often vehemently against each other in these post-conflict settings to actually agree on justice? And that's something that's really interesting to come out of this project, I think, is that both Sunnis and Shias, they definitely recognize proportionate justice. Like, they are not punishing fighters the same way as they're punishing, someone who just maybe paid taxes to ISIS and maybe was taken over, not willingly. And yeah, they do make big distinctions between was it a voluntary collaboration or not, or stuff like that. So both of them agree on that, and there is some overlap then in the types of punishments they seek for those middling groups. It's more maybe at the extremes that they disagree. So maybe that's one way to think about it too, and maybe that's another takeaway or a policy takeaway, and probably, I mean, I think mediators already know this, right, but they're target what you can, where is their agreement first, and then we'll get to those extreme issues and try to fix those last.
So I didn't get the paper in advance, so I didn't get a chance to read it. But I have a whole bunch of different questions. First of all, it's a fascinating way to think about it, but I have a couple different questions. One is, I'm not quite sure how to interpret the differences across the authorities, because my understanding is the way the question was asked, it's kind of objective for the state authorities. You don't get to pick who the state authority is in your area. It's a court, there's a judge for it. But the other ones, when you ask people, religious authorities in your area or tribal authorities in your area, there's a much more subjective choice of who you think is a religious authority in your area. There isn't necessarily like an assigned tribal area. It's not just nested. You could decide the tribe. It might be the sheikh of this fachad or clan of the shamar in this area, or it could be this person. It could be a sub-level person you think is the tribal authority. The tribal authority might not be a sheikh at all. It could just be like an elder person in the tribe who's well respected. And so when you're asking people the tribal authority in your area, they're able to pick somebody who they think already has authority. And so we would expect their judgment on that authority to have less wiggle room or less likely to go down, even if they make a mistake, than if they're objectively told someone else. And this is especially the case with Sunni religious authorities, because it's an extremely, the wording on the slides changed over time. Sometimes it was religious authorities, then there was /imam, and then the last slide said Sunni scholars, ulama. And so there's a lot of different things there, right? If you ask somebody in an area, if you just ask them religious authority, they could decide it's like a sheikh of the Naqshbandiya in Anbar. It could be like the preacher in the mosque. It could be the guy who's in charge of it for Al-Qaf in the whole area. And this is a key issue in areas formerly governed by ISIS. Who were the legitimate religious authorities in an area? Were they the clerics who ISIS forced out? Were they the clerics who cooperated with ISIS? Were they the ones who came back from abroad? So again, the objectiveness of their ability to choose who the authority is, I was a little confused by, and I wasn't quite sure how to understand those changes. Another thing is, the way the whole setup of it, fractured sovereignty is a heading you had on a slide. There's an assumption, I think the conventional way that scholars think about these things is like the state should have authority over these sorts of issues. But when the state is unable to do it or unwilling to do it, then people might be looking at these other social actors to do it. And so I don't want to say they're not on an even playing field, but your judgment on the appropriateness or the quote-unquote legitimacy, which is a term you didn't define really well, the legitimacy of a cleric to make a judgment on this is a function of whether or not the state is doing a good job on it in the first place. And so I was just trying to get a sense of, are these three different institutions, do you see them as in competition in people's minds for making judgments on these things? I know your experimental setup allows you to kind of get around that by saying this person was asked this question, this person was asked this question. So they weren't asked on the legitimacy of this, making a judgment with this gap. But I'm just wondering how you're thinking about it. Do you see these three institutions as in competition with one another? Are they nested in some way? And how do we know whether or not individuals think these people should be making, these social institutions, religious leaders, tribal leaders, or the state should be making judgments on these things at all? And that's a way to, if you want to connect it to a larger literature, I mean, there is a larger literature by Kalivas and others that talk about, there's this meta-narrative of the conflict, Sunni, Shia, Sunni, Shias, and Kurds, it's like lions, tigers, and bears. But the actual violence that happens at the local level, which is what you're asking people to judge on, that's driven by really local level grievances, right? This person, I was in a car accident with somebody months ago, and I didn't get justice from that because that person was connected to so-and-so. You'd expect kind of tribal leaders especially to be able to be manipulated by those sorts of local level things. And so I think especially the Iraqis I know would be skeptical about tribal leaders actually closing gaps on those sorts of things because they're more easy to manipulate them in these sorts of petty grievances sort of things than perhaps a state court. And so I'm wondering if you want to tie it into that sort of grievance literature at all.
Closing the gaps in what area? Sorry.
People use these post-conflict dispute mechanisms or justice mechanisms to settle old scores, which don't match up with the meta-narrative of what happened, right? It's somebody came and took my house when I was away and I can't get it back. And you can use tribal leaders the tribal leader saying that, no, this person didn't do this. It's because they're connected to somebody or somebody's paying them off or something like that. We can talk more about it offline, but I'm wondering if people are evaluating these three different actors to the same standard.
Ifek had a two-finger, do you want it? Is it okay if we just add
Sure.
one more?
Yeah, I was curious if when injustice gap happens, do people think of other actors then? Let's say they now know that the punishment is larger than or greater than they expected, and then do they think that, oh, then they're talking about this other religious authority who would be more likely to give a harsher punishment after that? So does that affect, do you think it's possible that it affects the actor that they attribute the punishment to or the decision to?
Okay, yeah. No, these are great, great questions. I think I probably should have just stopped you at your first one so that I could handle that first, because it went on so long, I'm not sure. So you can tell me then if I'm not answering things, because I might have missed some. Okay, sorry, I did send the paper, but then unfortunately Max went on vacation, and so it should have gotten sent earlier today. So it's somewhere in your inbox, hopefully. And then, okay, the first part about thinking about differing authorities and, you know, who are they thinking about, and is that fair to compare state authorities to these other local authorities? So the prompt you can look up in the paper, it is really localized. It is also, local state Iraqi court judges, so whatever's the closest to you. You don't necessarily choose that person either. These sorts of differences should be, I guess I'm wondering how you think they would affect the experiment. So I would think that, the purpose of the experiment is to try to understand in a general sense when we say these things. These authorities are actually being used right now, both by the Iraqi state and international organizations, to get, people back into these communities. And they are imposing certain punishments, or, sometimes rightly or wrongly. Usually it's a complementarity situation. So when I described earlier about the differing systems and how they often work in tandem, that is usually in this sort of case what's happening. There are, of course, other cases where they're in competition. And I don't agree that people only turn to these authorities when the state is not present. There are lots of reasons people turn to the authorities. Yes, state incapacity is one of them. There's all kinds of other things that determine whether you turn to one authority versus another. The state is usually more expensive. Yes, it's further away, so it's not even accessible. It might have to do with the issue that you're dealing with. So I try in the experiment to try to hold as much of that as constant as possible. The issue is staying the same for everyone. And then I'm hoping that all of these other factors are sort of randomizing, like they should, since the experiment is using randomization inference, then all of this other stuff should be evenly distributed across the arms of the experiment. And so it might be there in the background, and it might be a factor but it's kind of working as like a control variable in the background in these cases. And I can't really speak to it that much because I didn't focus specifically on it. That sort of gets at this, do people think of other actors? I guess what you're saying is that in the first part, you were told your religious authorities and then you switch. But the punishment and the authority are happening at the same time. So I don't know why you would switch who you're thinking of later on.
Religious authority that they could think of as a religious authority.
Right.
And they could attribute, oh, maybe this other one would be more likely to use that punishment.
So I don't think that that's something that I can actually speak to.
A different way, I think, if I understand, a different way of thinking about this question is that if there's a gap when the court says something, that affects the quote-unquote legitimacy of the state writ large. People can't choose another court to go to. But if this tribal leader, there's a large gap, they can just say, well, there's a different tribal authority who I think is the real leader in this area. Same with religious leaders. If this imam...
Fine, but wouldn't that have, like, that would probably lead me to more null effects on the tribal and religious authorities.
It's not
right? If I can just switch.
Religious authorities writ large. It's delegitimizing that particular guy who then they can switch to a different guy.
Right, but the experiment is about that particular guy.
But it sounds like you're making, you want to generalize and make larger claims about this category of sub-state actor.
I mean, it's that particular guy for each respondent of 4,500 respondents, so there's a lot of different that particular guys. So yes, then I am sort of drawing generalizations across. I mean, I also think it's, it's 3 different governorates. These are very different people that are in my sample. I think it's fair to draw at least some sort of more generalized finding from this, yeah.
About religious, okay. Maybe we phrase it a different way.
Next question. Okay, Oded.
So thank you. I found your paper really interesting, important. I think the project is very pertinent. And I think you've got really important insights about the importance of legitimacy in particular amongst the target group in particular, I think, that is marginalized by the state. I want to push you a little bit on the concept of justice. So I understand what you mean by the injustice gap, but I'm not sure what you mean by justice, or what is meant by justice, which is a premise for an injustice gap. So normally when I think about justice, I kind of think about the sort of the ethical and moral principles that guide applications of laws. I think what you really have is law enforcement rather than justice. So law enforcement focuses on the practical application of laws. And it strikes me that what you are measuring here isn't injustice or an injustice gap as such, but I think what you're really finding is about, what you're finding, the real findings are about the trust in the application of the law, and the difference is when it's a local authority versus the state authority. Right, so there is less trust in the state to conduct a due process, particularly by the excluded minority or the marginalized minority. I think that's the main finding here, which is great, which I think is a great finding. I'm just not sure that there is justice in it.
So how would you define justice again?
So I think justice is kind of the ethical and moral principles that guide the application of laws. The ideals of fairness and equity, whereas the law is kind of, the law enforcement focuses on the practical applications of the laws. So if I'm a member of the Sunni minority, I'll trust my tribal leader to conduct the due process and reach the outcome. I may not trust state authorities that are predominantly Shia, because I know that they are prejudiced against me, or that.
Which is what I say.
Right,
But
I think you say that. But
I think that second
it's
part
not
is much more about legitimacy, and the first part, I guess we're gonna have to disagree on the definition of justice, and I guess it just depends on which field and which discipline you're approaching this from. So I did explain that the first part I take from psychology, but also actually if you look at all the way back in from 600 AD in the codification of Roman law, it's sort of like the definition of justice is really like to eat his due recompense or something like this. I mean, I can send you the actual citation, but I mean, it's sort of this notion that if somebody does a wrong, they sort of pay it back somehow. And there are different conceptions of justice, right? There's restorative justice, there's retributive justice, and this is a much more retributive justice sort of thinking and interpretation. I tried to build in a little bit of restorative justice with the community service sort of part of it. But it's also, justice has also been thought about it has these purposes of deterrence, and that's also how do you deter? You impose things that people don't like, but also maybe you actually imprison them and keep them out of the population. Maybe you impose capital punishment. But to me, justice is really about the recompense.
May I push further, or are there others? Okay. So because we're dealing with transitional justice, because we're dealing with societies that are post-conflict in particular, different communities are going to have very different notions of what justice is, right? right? And that's going to be, that's inevitable, right? Whether it's in this case or in sort of in the Balkans, Serbs and Croats are going to have very different notions. So at some point, no actor is going to be pleased. Whatever, Croats will say, okay, that's justice for us, then Serbs will immediately say that's unjust. So you're never going to be able to get into that sort of objective.
Against that, right? Like at the end, I talked about how, yes, in many of these societies, we have people with varying perceptions of what is just, and that's why we sort of want to measure it and understand it as a subjective concept that is shaped by how people, regular people on the ground, feel and think and react, and also probably shapes their behavior. But I think it's wrong to assume that there's always just like two separate versions of justice and never the two shall meet. I think that there are many cases where there are, like as I've already told you, and I can actually show you from this data, that Sunnis and Shias, for example, do agree on justice for many of these hypothetical collaborators we showed them. They don't often at the extremes, or they might be motivated even slightly differently for why they think one person deserves X punishment versus another. But I think it's wrong to think that like they're so far that they can't ever come back together. And we do have cases where, even though a lot of countries that experience violence fall back into it, there are cases where they don't.
So is that a two-finger?
You can skip me if you want to go.
I have 6 more people on the
Okay.
list, but if it's a two-finger, feel free to jump in, and then I'll go down the 6, and maybe we'll clump people together.
Okay.
I think on the question of this macro question of justice, I'm wondering if you could pull a little bit more on to what extent it matters that this is transitional justice. Like, and I think this gets at David's question as well, which is, if this were just a murder, stripped of any sort of political context, or car crash, would you be saying something different? Or is there something about transitional justice here that's especially impactful because it implies something about the relationship between communities and the state?
And I think that also, again, depends on the outcome we're talking about. So I think the injustice gap part, the like first part, that could apply potentially even for peaceful times. I wouldn't be surprised. For this part about the Sunni Shia, that I don't know. That might be driven, like especially if the finding on the Sunnis is driven by the fact that they feel like they're being unjustly targeted, then no, that's obviously not going to matter in the regular case of a car accident.
Okay, so let me just read out who I have on the list, and then let's do like 2 at a time. So I have Alberto, Sima, Gal, Fayad, Ahmed, and Zoe. So let's start with Albert.
Okay, Alberto Lopez here, fellow at the Center for European Studies and assistant professor in the Free University of Amsterdam. Thank you very much for your presentation. I didn't have the chance to read the paper, but I really found it important and I learned a lot. So my question has to do with the punishment gap. So it has two sub-questions. One is about, so I see the incrementality of it, like, and I see how it goes, it builds up, but I see like the capital punishment is in some way substantively different to just adding years to the penalty that the person faces. So I think it would be interesting to at least empirically just treat it as or just check whether there's like a gap, that is just especially significant there. And see how the effects change when you pass from just adding years to just having a capital punishment.
Actually, so the robustness checks I do cut out both if the person themselves wanted these extremes of either capital punishment or amnesty, and also then if they saw these extreme gaps. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Then, in that respect, I wonder whether you take into account whether Sunni or Shia have like different views on these capital beliefs. I don't know if you measure their beliefs on the capital punishment.
Oh, you just mean like in general their beliefs about capital punishment, not for these hypothetical collaborators.
Maybe both things could be in a way conducive to.
There's the punishments. 1 is amnesty, 5 is capital. So you can see there is definitely Shia want stronger at the outset.
Yeah, well, yeah, I guess, you know, there could be like some, you know, some explanation
But
going on there.
Yeah. And I think also just notice though the proportion of the sample, it's, you know, the height of it is at 40%. So.
Yeah. Yes. And then, yeah. So if we talk about the gap, mostly like you know, people, you know, like authorities going, you know, farther. I wonder what are the effects when the gap is on the opposite direction. Whether you know, like I would like to know, you know, for thinking about the targeted group, what makes them look at the, you know, the authorities as being legitimate? What makes them cross the line to be like from unlegitimate to legitimate? And I wonder what is you know, like what is the role of the gap, like the negative gap, basically, like authorities being more permissive and more forgiving than what they, you know, in principle were going to be, right? Because maybe you were mentioning it, like they are sometimes also like imposing, you know, quite stringent, or you know, there's variation on how they punish. So I really wonder the extent to which what happens when the authorities actually punish their side less than they, you know, thought, or you know, like, and whether this is like substantively different from the other side. It goes kind of like in the direction of this, you know, thinking on the two sides.
The under and over punishment?
Yes.
That was shown.
Okay.
The effects are the same.
Okay.
Surprisingly.
And by group the same, no?
Oh, you mean for Sunnis and Shias? Remember, well, for the over punishment, the effects are pretty much the same, but then it depends on the authority. So really for Sunnis, over punishment by the state.
Under punishment, yeah.
Or under punishment, oh. Have I looked at that by? I think I have looked at that. I don't think there's anything that interesting there, but I will check it again. Okay, thanks.
Oh, thank you. Thanks to you.
And I have Seema next.
Hi, my name is Seema, and I'm a PhD student in the Gov department. Just quick two-finger on the last question. I was curious to hear more of a justification on why you chose absolute value. Because you know, as your work has shown, like the direction of the recompense matters. And so I was curious, was it like a question of power, that why you didn't split up these groups and see the results that way? And then sort of stepping back, I'm curious about a potential scope condition, which is sort of the existence of a perception of equity that exists pre-conflict. Because I wonder how the pre-conflict justice system sort of affects people's perception and ability to construct a counterfactual that they can sort of judge against what's currently being offered, and how that interacts with their idea of legitimacy.
Can you explain that more? You mean like prior to the conflict, did they have all of these sources to go to solve disputes?
So more in the sense of did they believe, was there a perception of equity, that they could get access to equity from these institutions? Like I'm thinking of other pre-conflict situations that were clearly very unequal, and then post-conflict people have more access, but then there's a sort of like counter movement against it. Thinking like the American Civil War.
The equity, you mean equity in taking your case to these different leaders? Or what do you mean by equity? I'm getting confused by that.
I think equity in terms of outcomes, but also equity in terms of access to these institutions.
Okay.
So, because I think that sort of matters in how people frame like what's possible.
Yeah.
Post-conflict.
For sure. So in this specific case, all three of these actors are present in many, if not all, of these processes. But I agree with you, like in general, like there might be issues of differing access if you wanted to take your specific case to these differing leaders, that you're going to think about that you might forum shop, so go to a different leader time and time, like, you know, I don't like what I got from the religious leader, maybe I'll go to the tribal leader next, and then I'll go to the, you know, but there are actually institutions also that kind of can prevent that. The tribal leader does, I mean, these authorities do have differing abilities to sort of enforce their rules, and a lot of that is social sanctioning and stuff. So it does constrain you a bit. And of course then like women, it probably have a tougher time in many cases. Poorer people have a much tougher time to access the state. I agree with all of that. And I do have another study that actually tries to look at like taking these exact cases that Biff was talking about, like car crashes or things lesser than murder, more civil cases, to these 3 different authorities. But that's a different study. Yeah.
Okay. Gal.
Hi.
Thank you very much. It was really, really interesting. I have a small question. I was wondering whether the information you provided respondents with the fact that their authority has investigated the case has any additional effect or any effect on how they think about the fairness and of their, I don't know, each authority decision. So I wonder whether respondents' maybe level of trust in each authority may shape the way they evaluate the investigation process, and whether they perceive it as a fair or sufficiently thorough in any sense.
Yeah. So again, since the measures are sort of comparing this pre-treatment versus post-treatment, and it's sort of it would be randomizing different people with differing levels of trust in these authorities at the outset into the differing arms that shouldn't really play a role, at least for the experimental outcomes. I'm not saying that it's not important, of course, but and then the investigated the case, I did include that terminology just to try to show people that the authorities, this is not like a willy-nilly thing for them. They are actually caring about it and have put some effort into looking at the case and thinking it through. And I thought that that would better tap into sort of this notion of legitimacy and the authority of their decisions. But yeah, no, but thank you. That's helpful.
I'm Fayad. I'm an assistant professor in the Gov department. I was curious as you were thinking through some of the differences between the different types of leaders, whether like their source of how they evaluate these cases matter rather than the position itself. So it's possible that religious leaders are deriving it from some religious text. Traditional tribal leaders maybe some custom or some sort of followed down tradition, and then state government some sort of legal written down rule. And so it's possible that the differences are not coming from the identity of the individual, but rather like how you interpret where the rule is derived from. And I wonder if you've looked into that or thought through that. I
have thought through that, and maybe it's not enough in this paper, and it is in that other paper, which by the way I'm happy to send if you, it's actually posted publicly, but I have a better version of it now. I think the source of authority really does matter, and I had actually that on that slide, and then I took it out because it was like too much information, I thought. But I do think that the state is supposed to have these written rules that it should follow. Whereas like we know from these focus groups that people think that the state's rules that it's following is often too rigid. And I put this in that other paper, and maybe I should put some of it in here too, but it's like, it is this idea sometimes that like the state has this like prescribed thing, and it's like doesn't actually think about us or help us. Whereas like this restorative justice concept that like you talk to victims and you try to like figure out how can you get the community to come back together again. That is a much more tribal, like people think that their tribal leaders are much more interested in that. Because I mean the tribal leaders' whole goal often, and we know about this from Fiona and Layton's work on their works on tribal leaders and everything, they are seeking to prevent like the recurrence of violence. And there's this whole process very well laid out. I cited in the paper about, tribal leaders getting together and they come with these agreements. There's these rules about a 3-day ceasefire usually if there was, violence, and then they discuss it and they try to figure out what do the victims want. And this is getting back to justice too. Like that whole process is really about what do victims want? What will make them feel better about this wrong that has happened? You can't bring the person back from the dead, but you could potentially pay reparations or something. We've lost a son who can bring in income for the family or help his wife and child, and now that's lost. What can this other family do to make up for that, right? And then with the religious authorities, I mean, they also seek reconciliation, but they're also maybe applying this sort of divine law, right? And a lot of their authority also comes from the idea that the enforcement mechanism is also that this is sanctioned by God, right? So yeah, I totally agree with that. And that's actually a really good point, and maybe I need to emphasize that more.
Great. Hi, Kristen. I'm Ahmed.
Are you? I've never met you before.
We are close. So I have a quick question about the injustice gap measurement. So as far as I can see, your ISIS profile is randomized, being married to cooking, fighting, and paying tax to them. But still, it might be really interesting to see that. Does injustice gap affect legitimacy differently for different types of cooperation with ISIS? For example, 2-point injustice gap for being married to an ISIS member might be something different effect than 2-point injustice gap for fighting for an ISIS. Did you check that, or?
You know what, I really want to, but I think the power is not going to be there. I guess I should try it. I should try it. That's a good point, yeah. It'd be really cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's my, I had that question too. So Zoe's next, and then Mecca.
I think a lot of my questions have been answered, one of which was this question. But I wanted to go back to this point about the randomization of like what they did and the randomization of what they're doing to return. And I was just curious if you could give us like any of the descriptive sense making that you got from that, particularly insofar as it correlates linearly with the justice preferences. Because I'm really curious whether or not, based on my priors and based on some of your and Mara's further research, like how much this spread is triggered by the randomization of what they've done or what they're saying they'll do to return, and how much it's like stochastic kind of, either within the Shia or I would be more surprised if it was within the Sunni population. And like the sort of second half of that question, which is a bit more of a like fun question, is maybe a stretch given the topic, but like what would be your advice to somebody who has a Sunni minority and has that sort of distribution of justice preferences, insofar as they're trying to like mitigate the justice gap, but people want different things. So this is one of the things I found in my research is like there are these sort of like bimodal preferences sometimes, and I don't know if they're latent in all societies or if it appears in your work, but like when some people are like, you should just forgive them, they've said they're sorry, that was like, you know, distraught times, and you should definitely kill them. And I'm like, so I pick a 3 on the justice scale? Like what's the plan in terms of avoiding the gap?
For the leader.
Yes.
Yeah. That's a good point. And a difficult one. And I don't know if I've thought that through that well. So first, for the easier one, then this is the outcomes of the original profile, which of course you're not going to really understand all of what's going on in those arms, but these are the effects on the change in punishment. And you can see also big effects for governorate, so where people are. That's also correlates with Sunnis and Shias. Yeah, so we can see then that there are big effects of what the person did, and these fighters are really getting these strong punishments. And that's what I meant by like there is agreement sort of on like in a lot of these sort of categories. Not always down here between like janitor and cook, and maybe even, but yeah, definitely like fighter versus taxpayer. There's a lot more agreement. So what do you do when they're at those extremes? I don't necessarily know. I think you could try to investigate those extreme people and understand better, like what could maybe get them to move. Like is capital, like yeah, I guess if people really want capital punishment no matter what, and it's not justified.
I meant more when there's like mixed preferences.
Yeah.
You know, when you have this sort of sense that some people in the community are forgiving and some people are like hardliners. And everything you've presented is like a justice gap is a really big problem for your legitimacy.
Right.
But you have to have the decision.
So I guess like I would think again that there are more people in the middle. There's not everyone is saying kill them all, and there's not everyone saying forgive them all. And I think that that's actually a rare case. And that's what this work sort of shows, that is a rare case. That usually people like do actually take into consideration what people have done, and they want justice to be proportionate to whatever the crime was committed. And then again, we try to figure out, I mean, so that sort of points to like another big problem in these cases is figuring out what people have actually done. And of course, there's also lots of debate about that, about dredging up old memories and et cetera, and can we actually ever establish the effects? But there are also, again, there easier cases and harder cases. There's often lots of documents and everything. ISIS left behind tens of thousands of documents, like with names and everything of what was done. So there is a way, and the Iraqi government was cooperating with the UN to figure this out, and then they kicked out the UN's team. So that's really sad. And they were even like excavating graves and everything. And yeah, it's very sad. Okay. Yeah, did that sort of answer some of it at least? Some of your concerns? And then, yeah, so you can kind of see what was the big drivers here. And maybe on the bigger effect ones, I could look at that times the injustice gaps, potentially, maybe have enough power.
Okay, so I've got 2 questions on my list, Natan and Denisa.
Thank you for the great presentation and project. A few questions. I was wondering if you looked into the descriptives of who are the ones who are over punishment, wanting over punishment versus under punishment. I can imagine, I don't know, I have a sense there might be different people. I don't know if they belong to either, one might be more Sunni versus Shia respondents or gender differences or those kind of things. And then in terms, a few small questions in terms of mechanisms, whether first, I didn't fully understand whether the measure of fairness is post-treatment or pre-treatment. Post-treatment, and then you interact that with the treatment.
Yes.
Okay, I don't know if that might be kind of problematic for like estimating treatment effects, just potentially for review.
No, it totally is. So this is, I mean, like I viewed it as a mechanism, and I registered it as a mediator, but then I realized causal mediation analysis was not going to work in this case. And so I'm just kind of like looking at it and exploring it, but it's not, yeah, I agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. An alternative may be to use it as an outcome. I mean, it doesn't fully resolve the problem. And then also, if you consider any alternative mechanisms such as emotions or anger toward perpetrators, those kind of issues.
Yeah, that's funny. I do have emotions in here, and I haven't gotten to analyzing them yet. So if you're interested and you have those skills, you could contact me, because it's just like, it's also like a bandwidth issue, you know? There's so much already going on. It's clearly not going to make it into this paper, so yeah. But that's great. I'm glad your mind went there.
Okay, Denisa, can you?
Thank you. Hi, my name is Denisa. I'm a scholar at Weatherhead Center. My question is about implicit bias, and to what extent there is some kind of a bias towards the types of crimes in this case, and I don't mean within the paying tax, cooking for them, but within the kind of larger crimes and the types of crimes, especially crimes against women. So do you think if it would be possible to disaggregate those views according to the types of crimes, that there would be difference, especially in terms of then whether it's state or religious or tribal justice? When it comes, let's just take crimes against women. So would there be some sort of bias there? And then secondly, just in terms of proportionate punishment, because if you look at it from the perspective of proportionate punishment, I think then the more reliable framework would be, and kind of I side here with Biff and Odette, transitional justice, because then there is a legal framework, international legal framework. There are rules-based punishment. It's kind of better defined rather than the tribal rules or the religious rules, which can be again biased. Okay. If it's not making sense, I'm happy to clarify.
Well, I think with the latter one, I don't think it's fair also to expect that tribal and religious leaders don't also think about proportionality of crimes. So even in like Sharia law, like there's heavier punishments for like murder versus theft versus adultery versus all these different types of crimes. Divorce, I don't know about the other ones, but so yeah. So I don't know also how that would bias my study, although I understand that there are differences in this, and I think it would be good to run a study more on that. And I think actually Igor Lazarev's work might be insightful there. He runs stuff in Chechnya that has these different types of authorities as well, and he runs 10 different types of scenarios, and the crimes do touch upon things like crimes against women, for example. Unfortunately, mine don't get into that so much. There is like a spouse here, and that's obviously those ones are gendered sort of roles, but yeah, it's not specifically getting at what you want to get at. I feel like we need to run some more studies to try to get at what you're talking about.
Just to give, I'm from Bosnia, so we've had debates about proportional punishment, and even when it's an international court, people will very often not be happy. And it will be different groups that will not be happy about punishment for different reasons. Some thinking it's over punishment, some thinking it's under punishment. It will be like the same punishment. So this is why I think, that there is implicit bias based on not only the groups themselves, but also on the types of punishment. So if we take, and I really like the question about the Yazidis, and for example, the kidnapping of Yazidi girls, and unfortunately not documented well enough, not researched well enough, but would those types of crimes be viewed equally if it's, because of this implicit bias, if it's Yazidi girls, for example?
What's the implicit bias?
It's kind of all the subconscious, underconscious, cultural, religious set of beliefs or system beliefs. Yeah.
Right, and so then in this case, what do you think, which way does that run?
I would think that going back to the concept of transitional justice, it's this is why we have transitional justice and rules, because they will set certain rules on what's proportionate punishment. And I think there you would see a difference if people would rely more on tribal courts or religious courts compared to the state courts, because that might be maybe more in line with what's socially acceptable or those kind of biases.
Yeah. So I think this also gets at what David was saying, is that this is very localized, and I think the processes that I'm talking about are very localized, and this may not be only a localized issue. And then you also talked about the rules about international organizations. That's also, very important topic that this project is unfortunately limited from speaking to. Yeah. But I would like to, I think this speaks to like my future work and where I should try to think about maybe going.
Well, I think on that note, thank you so much
Yeah.
for sharing your work with us.